Hello, welcome to Middle East Conversation. I'm Dr. Elif Selin Çalik. If you are tuning into this podcast, you already understand the crucial role water and environment plays in the transition to sustainable future. With the right individuals leading the way in top companies, sustainability becomes more than just a buzzword. That's why today I'm excited to host Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud, Director of Climate and Water Program from Washington-based think tank Middle East Institute. Hello, Dr. Mohammed.
Hello, how are you?
Thank you so much. Welcome on board. Let me briefly share your background, Dr. Mohammed. Dr. Mahmoud's areas of expertise include climate change adaptation, water policy analysis, and scenario planning. Previously, he was a senior policy analyst with the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, where he provided research, modeling, and analysis on interstate Colorado River Basin programs, and also binational water issues between the United States and Mexico. In addition, he is a faculty associate with Arizona State University. So my question for you, Dr. Mohammed, this year's Bonn Climate Change Conference featured events and discussions focusing on climate issues such as adaptation, mitigation, and global stockade, and also climate loss and damage fund. So in that regard, progress on these issues at the Bonn conference is needed to translate into potential draft decision to be adopted at the COP28 meeting taking place in United Arab Emirates in Dubai later this week in December. So how will COP28 affect the Middle East sustainable and net zero 2050 targets?
Well, a lot of things are coming together at COP28. And I think there's a couple of tracks here. I mean, certainly what will transpire at COP28 could be impactful for the region, but I think also from a global sense. And the main thing that I'll reference here that has that impact is at COP28, we're going to see the culmination of a 2-year process that started at COP26 in the UK, which is the culmination of the global stocktake. Which essentially is going to serve as a benchmark moving forward. Because what the global stocktake is essentially doing, and I'm simplifying it here, is it's assessing how we as the world have performed in terms of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. How have we performed in terms of limiting the impacts of climate change, limiting the impacts of global warming, as a measure to determine what our trajectory now is going to look like moving forward. And we kind of know some of this information. I mean, in the last few years, a number of studies have come out in terms of how we're doing in terms of carbon emission reduction, how that's translating to warming. And a lot of it, unfortunately, isn't very optimistic in terms of meeting some of those initial warming target goals of limiting global warming, average global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. Studies indicate that we may already have blown past the ability to curb temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So one of the big things that's going to come out of COP28 definitively at the conclusion of the global stocktake process is truly where we are. And that will help us understand what is the new gap, or what is now the gap moving forward in terms of addressing climate change in a way that could hopefully mitigate the worst outcomes. The other thing that I think will also come to a head or hopefully continue to be resolved at COP28 is the larger issues of climate finance. Over the last year, certainly at COP27 in Egypt, one of the big news items was the culmination or agreement for the loss and damage fund. This idea that providing funding for mostly developing nations and nations that tend to disproportionately suffer from the impacts of climate change or have historically. So that is another piece of the climate financing that needs to be resolved. There's also other issues of climate financing that need to continue to be resolved. For example, the Global Adaptation Fund, which had an original set target in terms of a funding amount, has been severely underfunded. So I think with the UAE hosting this year and as actually historically a contributor of climate financing in different areas, could leverage global funding, certainly more so from the global north, to populate these funds for the intended purpose moving forward to actually pay for mitigation, and I'd argue maybe mostly so adaptation projects in developing nations to be able to start to address climate change more effectively. It's a lot of what has to do with climate action has to be on the ground, projects, implementation. And so that requires funding as part of doing that. But we need to, and I think the other piece that will be important in COP28 is this idea of pivoting towards action. You know, we've seen a lot of targets of emission control, targets of adaptation, targets of projects, targets of financing. I think COP28 has the opportunity, and certainly for the region itself, the Middle East region, where a lot of countries would be recipients of adaptation projects and climate financing, to actually start to have the conversation move from goals and plans and visions to implementation and action at projects on the ground.
Yes, I would love to focus on a little bit your role, your position at Middle East Institute as a director of climate and water program. As you know, water is the climate connector that offers opportunities for collaboration across the Sustainable Development Goals and also Paris Climate Agreement, which is signed in 2015 in Paris. And also, my question is, in your role as Middle East Institute Director of Climate and Water Program, you have witnessed over nearly a decade how important knowledge exchanges are vital as a tool to communicate the importance of water security to society and develop solutions to tackle problems related with too much flood, like in Pakistan last year, to little drought and also poor water quality, polluted water. So in that regard, how is water strategizing remaking the Middle East?
But I'm glad you asked this question. Excuse me. Water is so critical as it relates to the climate question. Of course, it's an important issue for me, just career-wise. That's where I started my career, and then expanded to impacts of climate, again connected to water. But water, water is an important piece of the water, food, energy nexus, and those things are completely interrelated. And when we think about climate, we're focusing on climate as a topic. When we think of adaptation, the largest area of adaptation in terms of solutions for climate adaptation is related to the water sector and water security because of how connected it is to other important factors or outcomes or consequences related to climate change. So I think maybe to answer your question, I'll just say something briefly to illustrate to listeners how critical water is in the Middle East region. I mean, water scarcity in the region is a known fact, but I think one of the things to highlight that is out of the most stressed water countries in the world, 12 of them are within this region. So just to put that in perspective, the region, for the most part, doesn't have, with two major exceptions. I think we can think of the two major river systems in the Middle East, the Nile Basin and the Tigris-Euphrates system. But absent those major systems, there really is no surface. There's no major surface rivers that are a reliable source of water supply in the region. Traditionally, people have relied on groundwater, and now, because of an absence of most freshwater sources, have relied on desalination as a way to create water system in those countries. But the importance of water is connected to the fact that most of water used, about on average globally, 60 to 70% goes towards food production. So water security is also food security. So in terms of how the region is thinking about water issues and the vulnerability of scarce and limited water supplies, a few things have happened, and I think a few other things are happening. I mean, the shift to desalination for some countries was a matter of survival. Groundwater was only going to be able to last for so long before it was going to be essentially depleted, or reserves go so low that they're, at least at the time, beyond the ability for countries and users to extract them. So desalination and desalination technologies are, we'll say, a fix for now in terms of the region accessing more water supply. The other piece is, how do you manage your water demand? Right? So if we have limited supply, one solution is to increase the amount of supply. That's where something like desalination comes into place. There's also other examples of, you may have heard of cloud seeding, where enhancing the clouds to produce more rain. There are some efforts within the region to create more robust programs. So for example, United Arab Emirates has a robust, for a while, has had a robust cloud seeding program, or you could call it rain enhancement there. And now that's starting to expand in other places of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is exploring it. Other countries have had pilot programs. I think in the Maghreb region, some of the countries there, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, have had some combination of testing this type of application. But besides increasing water that way, you have to look at how do you reduce your demand. Largest area of demand is agriculture by far. So some of the innovations in the Middle East that look towards that is, well, how do you still maintain a good level of food production, agricultural production, by still applying less water? And so there's been some more applications of shifting some of the water applications from things like flood irrigation, which still exists in parts of the Middle East, to things like drip, sprinkler irrigation systems, changing the types of crops that are being grown that maybe are less water intensive, or looking at trade agreements with other countries, maybe outside the region, to be able to grow maybe more water intensive crops outside, so not to stress water growth or water usage in intensive crops in the region. Like, I'll give you another example, Saudi Arabia. Yes. Grows some of its hay or alfalfa, which is very water intensive plant, in the southwestern United States, and then ships it back. And you could argue the cost, there's a cost associated with that, but that cost could still be significantly less than in terms of the amount of water that's needed to be generated and then consumed to grow such water intensive crops, which they need for their livestock and dairy farms, and to then support local food availability for neighboring countries. Some other countries have started to look at alternative forms of farming as a way to reduce water use. I know that Bahrain, for example, has started to invest a lot in hydroponic and greenhouse farming versus open field agriculture. Now, there's maybe some high cost initially for that startup. Also, it's more of a precision art. You need to apply a very specific amount of water in a very specific amount of way. But when you go past that initial startup period, you could have a successful food production enterprise that uses less water than open field agriculture. And then there's other applications, like how do you reduce water loss in conveyance systems and pipelines, other parts of the Middle East that have older infrastructure. If you look at areas like Jordan and Lebanon and even Syria, their water conveyance infrastructure loses a lot of water. So looking at investments now to how do you minimize that water loss and still maximize water use for the same amount of water being transported through the system. So I think, in short, just to answer your question, after that long explanation, is that the region is absolutely understanding the consequences of the reduced water supply and are exploring through innovative ways how to either maximize the water supply or reduce their water use while still utilizing or benefiting or gaining some of the same economic and social benefits from that water.
Yes, after highlighting, the importance of water for the sustainable future, Now it is better to focus on maritime resources, for the economic growth. So the World Bank defines the blue economy as the sustainable use of maritime resources for the economic growth, jobs, and improve livelihoods while preserving the marine ecosystem's health. So is blue the new green? What are the opportunities for developing a climate resilient blue economy in Middle East region, Dr. Mohammed?
I think that the water, I'll say sort of the maritime larger water bodies in terms of oceans and seas surrounding the region have a very critical importance strategically, economically, environmentally, etc., for the region, and I'd also argue for the world. So I'll give you the two examples that really make this point. One is the Gulf, the waters of the Gulf. Depending on your listeners, some may prefer Arabian Gulf, and some may prefer Persian Gulf. I'm not going to go either way. I'm just going to say the Gulf, and people know what I'm referring to.
Sure, for sure. Yeah.
That's a critical water body for a number of reasons. Locally and regionally, of course, it's a great source of tourism. It's a great source of food production. There's huge aquaculture industry in terms of fisheries that supports food production locally for the countries that are surrounding that water body. But also it is a very important transit water body for energy, for petroleum and energy and fuel that is shipped out of the region. Of course, it's one of the largest energy productive regions in the world. If you look at the Gulf region and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries that are large energy producers in terms of fossil fuel, natural gas, etc. So a lot of exports of energy, literally through tankers, through ships, exit and go back and forth in that water body. So it's important for the region, economically, in terms of food viability, etc., as well as the world. A lot of the world does depend on those energy exports that are literally transported through that water body, but also the fishery production, primarily within the direct region, but also to other parts of the world that are more closer to that region. And then there's also an environmental factor, right? So protecting the interests of one of those types of industries, whether it's the fisheries or the aquaculture or the transportation for the energy sector or tourism, or even the environmental benefits, protecting the coral reefs. Protecting one doesn't necessarily impact the other. In fact, I would say there's a collective benefit or outcome to protecting all of those. I don't think there's a way where you protect one and harm the other. So I think, of course, some may veer towards the economic side of, yes, the importance of the continued export of energy, yes, the continued importance of food production through fisheries. But I would argue you'd also want to protect those environmental habitat, because that also contributes to better fisheries and better food production from the ocean, limits potentially algae growth that could constrain or affect the ability of transportation and shipping. So to your point, yes, the blue economy is important, not just from environmental perspective at a first level, but also has consequences. When you do protect the environment, then you also provide benefits to these other sectors. Another water body that I'll mention is important. It's kind of cheating because it's sort of mentioning two water bodies, which is the interconnect between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. When you think about the Suez Canal, which has very strategic economic importance. And so as a consequence of the Suez Canal serving as a shortcut essentially between Europe, Eastern Africa and Asia, now the strategic economic importance of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea are also elevated. Sure, essentially we've covered all the water bodies surrounding the larger water bodies surrounding the region. And of course, we know the Red Sea and Mediterranean do have economic and environmental value as well. They're great places of tourism, they're great places of environmental activity and conservation of species and marine life that also needs to be preserved. So I think we're also shifting to, hopefully, shifting to a time where there's larger recognition on the importance of these water bodies, not just from an economic and energy and export and transportation perspective, but how that is also connected to the environmental benefits that need to be protected as well.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. And last but not least, I'm sure we are going to have another meetings with you together. As a founder and as a female energy expert, as a founder of one NGO about women in smart energy, I would love to ask this question to you because you are also one of the leaders in Middle East on sustainable life. So, women leaders, I'm sure that you agree with me, women leaders are key in Middle East battle against climate change. According to the study, female investors and policymakers on the corporate and public level are twice as likely to consider ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance investing when compared to men. And female investors and policymakers are twice as likely to consider ESG investing as compared to their male counterparts. And also, a specific study, this was the general study, but specific study by Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation in collaboration with American University in Cairo and also Arabian Business has revealed that the inclusion for female representation in organizations is essential to meet net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So what do you think about women empowerment on sustainable economy in the region? Do you see any development on this glass ceiling?
A great question. First of all, I, of course, support this concept of women empowerment and involvement. And I will take it a step further before I give you examples of how we're hopefully seeing things trending the right way as far as that's concerned. I'll take it a step further and say, generally speaking, but I'll address the sort of specifically in terms of role of women in addressing the climate crisis through the different sectors, right? Talked about in the energy sector, but in other sectors as well that feed into this, is the more sort of diversity of viewpoints, experience, that we can incorporate into addressing the climate crisis, I think we'd all be better for it, right? And I'd even take it a step further in terms of not just the engagement of women, but different types of women, right? Younger women, youth, incorporation of youth,
right.
Minority women. I mean, the thing that for me is important about this issue is, for a long time, there was only a certain group of people that sort of dictated the direction in terms of things, for good or for bad. It just was the way it was. Thankfully, that is changing, or it has been changing, but we can even do a better job. It's not just incorporating women, but incorporating different types of women. And I argue this across the board, but since we're focusing on women in position of leadership, but women in minority groups, younger women that would not traditionally be considered for these roles, not because of their lack of experience and skill and knowledge. We need to diversify the accessibility of people to be able to engage. There's nothing worse than exclusion, which has sort of been the modus operandi, unfortunately, for a while, but to increase inclusion across the board. And in the case of women, increasing sort of the engagement of women, and certainly women leaders, or ability of women to become more leaders in the space by giving opportunities that, frankly, for a lot of them, and even across the board, are well-deserved and have not been given. Thankfully, in a sense, I see that changing. There's still a lot of work. We're not perfect society in that regard, but there's some shining examples. I mean, you look across the Middle East region, there are certainly good examples where women have been elevated to positions of, I won't just say leadership. Sometimes leadership positions are just, in some cases token, but in positions where they're actually doing something. And look at since we've been talking about COP28, I'll use the easy example of the UAE, of the amount of leadership. I mean, look at the COP28 team and the supporting structure around the COP28 team. Their youth climate champion is a woman. Their high-level champion is a woman. One of their key, several of their key positions that are supporting COP28, the Minister of Climate and Environment is a woman. And it's not just highlighting that they're women, but look at the things they've done. They're very active. They're pushing the envelope forward. And there are other examples in other parts of the Middle East. We could be here all day talking about that. That's the good thing. But there's still a lot of more room to grow in terms of engagement of women, and I'd argue even further other underrepresented groups in this addressing the climate crisis.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for your informative insight, Dr. Mohammed. Today, we hosted Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud. He's the Director of Climate and Water Program from Washington-based think tank, Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.